Sometimes the most precious gifts come wrapped in rust and ridicule. When 8-year-old Clara Martinez lost her grandmother, she thought she'd lost her best friend forever, until an old steam locomotive began calling to her the same way Grandma's bedtime stories once did. Everyone in Cedar Junction laughed when Clara and her grieving grandfather spent their last $300 on that broken-down train. The town called them foolish. Neighbors whispered that grief had clouded their judgment. But Clara knew something they didn't. Deep inside that rusty engine sat a brass box containing wartime secrets worth $18 million. The real question wasn't about the money, though. It was whether this incredible discovery would bring Clara's family together or drive them apart forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted Cedar Junction in shades of amber and rust, much like the forgotten locomotive that would soon change everything. Clara Martinez sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, carefully arranging her collection of train sketches, while her grandfather Luis prepared their simple breakfast of eggs and toast. The small adobe house on Saguaro Street had grown quiet since Grandma Maria passed 3 months ago, filled now with the kind of silence that makes memories echo louder than words. Clara's fingers traced the silver locket around her neck, a gift from her grandmother, containing a faded photograph of the three of them at last year's county fair. Inside that tiny frame, Maria's eyes sparkled with the same mischief that had filled her bedtime stories about trains that carried more than passengers, locomotives that whispered secrets to those who knew how to listen. "Misha, come eat before your eggs get cold," Luis called from the kitchen, his voice carrying the gentle authority of a man who had raised Clara since her parents died in a car accident when she was 4. At 72, Luis moved with the careful precision of someone whose body held decades of hard work in the copper mines, but whose spirit remained unbroken despite recent losses. The kitchen walls displayed a lifetime of family photographs. Maria in her wedding dress, baby Clara taking her first steps, family gatherings around holiday tables that seemed to grow smaller each year. But it was the railroad memorabilia scattered throughout the house that caught a visitor's attention. Vintage timetables, conductor's lanterns, and an old Purple Heart medal that Luis kept in a frame but rarely discussed. "Grandpa," Clara said, settling into a chair and studying his weathered face, "tell me again about the trains Grandma used to talk about." Luis paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. Maria's stories had always seemed like folklore, tales spun to entertain a young girl's imagination. But since her passing, he'd begun wondering if there might have been more truth in them than he'd realized. She used to say that during the war, some trains carried secret messages along with the mail, he said carefully. Routes that weren't on the regular schedules, stops that only certain people knew about. Clara's eyes brightened with the same intensity they'd held the night before when she'd announced her dream about a calling locomotive. And she said some of those trains are still out there, waiting for the right person to find them. Through the kitchen window, the desert stretched toward the mountains, broken only by the abandoned rail yards on the edge of town. Cedar Junction had once thrived as a railroad hub, but when the copper mines closed and the main line was rerouted, the town slowly withered like a plant denied water. Now it survived on retiree pensions, a handful of small businesses, and the stubborn pride of people who refused to abandon the only home they'd ever known. The phone rang, interrupting their quiet breakfast. Luis answered with his customary politeness, but Clara could see his jaw tighten as he listened. "Mrs. Henderson, I appreciate your concern, but—" He held the phone away from his ear as the neighbor's voice rose to a volume Clara could hear from across the table. "Yes, I understand you're worried about our financial situation, but Mrs. Henderson had been Maria's closest friend and had appointed herself the family's unofficial guardian since the funeral. Her intentions were good, but her methods often felt more invasive than helpful. No, we haven't made any rash decisions," Luis continued patiently. Clara had a vivid dream, that's all. We're not about to spend money we don't have on. His expression changed as Clara tugged on his sleeve. Pointing toward the window, there, visible through the morning haze, the old rail yard stretched like a graveyard of abandoned dreams. And sitting on a forgotten siding, partially hidden by desert scrub and decades of neglect, was the locomotive from Clara's dream. Even from this distance, its distinctive profile was unmistakable. A steam engine from another era, its paint long since surrendered to rust and weather. "Mrs. Henderson, I need to go," Louise said, hanging up despite her continued protests. He looked at Clara, whose small face held a determination that reminded him powerfully of his late wife. "That's the train from your dream." Clara nodded solemnly. "She's calling to us, Grandpa." Just like Grandma said they would. Luis studied his granddaughter's face, seeing not childish fantasy, but something deeper, a conviction that seemed too mature for her 8 years. Since Maria's death, Clara had shown remarkable strength, comforting him through his darkest moments while processing her own grief with a wisdom that both impressed and worried him. "We should at least go look at it," Clara said quietly. Grandma always said that sometimes the most important things look broken on the outside. An hour later, they walked through the rail yard's rusted gates. Jake Morrison, the yard's owner, was a man who wore skepticism like armor, built from decades of dealing with scrap metal dealers and dreamers who thought they could resurrect the past. That old engine? Jake squinted at the locomotive through cigarette smoke. Hell, she's been sitting there since the 70s. Desert Rose, they used to call her. Ran mail routes during the war, then freight until the line closed. Been thinking about selling her for scrap, but the metal ain't worth much with all the rust. Clara approached the locomotive with the reverence others might reserve for entering a cathedral. Desert Rose stretched nearly 60 feet long. Her black paint faded to grey, windows clouded with decades of desert sand. But Clara saw past the deterioration to the elegant curves of her boiler, the proud stance of her driving wheels, the dignity that rust couldn't completely erase. How much? Luis found himself asking, though his practical mind screamed warnings about their dwindling savings. 300 takes her, Jake said with a shrug. Course you'd need to figure out how to move her, and Lord knows what kind of repairs she'd need. Engine's been sitting dead for 40 years, $300. Their entire emergency fund, carefully hoarded from Luis's modest pension after paying for Maria's medical bills. It was money they couldn't afford to spend, resources they desperately needed for basic survival. But as Luis watched Clara place her small hand against the locomotive's weathered side, he saw something he'd rarely witnessed since Maria's death. Hope. She's beautiful, Clara whispered, walking slowly around the massive machine. Grandpa, can you hear her? Luis listened to the desert wind whistling through the locomotive's broken windows, the creak of settling metal, the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. He heard nothing unusual, nothing that suggested this rusted hulk was anything more than exactly what it appeared to be. But Clara's face glowed with joy as she pressed her ear against the locomotive's side. She's telling me about the places she's been, the people she's carried. She says she's been waiting for us, that evening. As Luis stared at their checkbook and tried to rationalize what every logical part of his mind screamed was financial suicide, he thought about the stories Maria used to tell, tales of trains that carried more than cargo, locomotives that served purposes their official records never revealed. He thought about Clara's drawings, her dreams, her unshakable belief that this rusted engine held secrets worth discovering. He thought about his granddaughter's strength through loss, her courage in the face of an uncertain future, and the promise he'd made to Maria to always support Clara's dreams. The next morning, Luis walked into Jake Morrison's office and signed the papers that would transfer ownership of Desert Rose to the Martinez family. As he handed over their last $300, he felt simultaneously terrified and oddly at peace. Clara's reaction was pure joy, but not the giddy excitement of a child receiving a toy. Instead, She approached their locomotive with the solemnity of someone accepting a sacred responsibility. "Don't you worry about what people say," Louise told her as they stood together beside their improbable purchase. "Your grandmother always said that the most important things in life often look impossible at first." But as they walked home, Louise couldn't ignore the stares of neighbors, the whispered conversations that stopped when he approached, the phone calls that would surely come from well-meaning friends questioning his judgment. He'd just spent their emergency money on a 40-year-old locomotive that didn't run, couldn't be moved, and served no practical purpose he could explain. What he couldn't have known was that within Desert Rose's hollow shell, hidden in compartments designed by wartime engineers, lay secrets that would transform not just their lives, but the entire community that had watched their purchase with such skepticism. As Clara fell asleep that night clutching her grandmother's locket, she dreamed once again of Desert Rose, but this time, the locomotive wasn't calling to her from a distance. This time, Clara was inside the cab, listening to stories that would soon change everything they thought they knew about hope, faith, and the power of believing in something bigger than yourself. The phone started ringing at 7 in the morning, 3 days after they'd signed the papers for Desert Rose. Louise answered groggily, still reaching for his coffee, to find Mrs. Henderson's voice crackling with barely contained outrage. "Louise Martinez, what in heaven's name were you thinking? The whole town's talking about how you finally lost your grip on reality. Poor Clara's going to suffer because you can't tell the difference between grief and good sense anymore." Louise held the phone away from his ear, watching Clara carefully butter her toast at the kitchen table. She seemed untroubled by the controversy swirling around their decision, humming softly to herself while sketching another locomotive in the margins of her notebook. "Eleanor, I appreciate your concern." Concern. "Louise, you just threw away your emergency money on a pile of rust. What happens when Clara gets sick? What happens when your truck breaks down? What happens when the electric company comes calling?" The questions hit harder because Louise had asked himself the same ones through 3 sleepless nights. But each time doubt crept in, he remembered Clara's face when she first saw Desert Rose. The way her eyes had lit up with something he hadn't seen since Maria's death. Pure, unguarded hope. After hanging up on Mrs. Henderson's continued lectures, Louise found similar conversations waiting throughout the day. Bob Martinez, no relation despite the name, stopped by from his auto repair shop with genuine concern etched into his weathered features. "Look, Louise, I've known you since we were kids working the mine together. You're not a foolish man, but people are worried you're making decisions based on grief instead of good sense." Clara looked up from where she was organizing her colored pencils by the window. "Mr. Bob, have you ever owned something that other people thought was worthless but you knew was special?" Bob's expression softened as he looked at the serious 8-year-old. "Well, I suppose I have, sweetheart. Got an old Mustang in my garage that most folks would call a rust bucket. But you see what it could be, not just what it looks like now," Clara said, with the wisdom that continued to surprise the adults in her life. "That's how I feel about Desert Rose." Bob nodded slowly, though Louise could see the concern still lingering in his eyes. "I tell you what, Clara, if you and your grandpa need any help with that train, I've got tools and some free time on weekends." After Bob left, Louise felt the weight of the community's skepticism settling around him like desert dust. Even the mailman had made pointed comments about expensive hobbies during tough times. By afternoon, the doubt was eating at him like acid. "Clara, Mija, maybe we should reconsider this decision. We could probably still get our money back from Jake. Use it for something more practical." Clara set down her sketch pad and studied her grandfather's face with the kind of direct gaze that seemed too mature for her years. "Grandpa, do you remember what you told me after Grandma's funeral? When I was crying because I thought I'd never feel close to her again." Louise nodded, remembering that terrible afternoon when Clara's grief had finally broken through her brave facade. "You said that love doesn't disappear just because someone goes to heaven. You said Grandma's love would find new ways to show itself if I paid attention and kept my heart open." The truth of his own words, spoken back to him by his 8-year-old granddaughter, hit Luis like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on the practical concerns, the financial risks, the community judgment, that he'd forgotten the deeper lesson he'd tried to teach Clara about faith and love, persisting through loss. Desert Rose is how Grandma's love is showing itself now, Clara continued quietly. I can feel it every time I'm near her. Not in a scary way, but like a hug that comes from somewhere deep inside the train. That evening, they received an unexpected visitor. Tommy Chen knocked on their door, just as the sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows across their small yard. At 35, Tommy was one of the few young people who had stayed in Cedar Junction after college. Working as a freelance researcher and historian from his home office, Mr. Martinez, I hope you don't mind the intrusion. But I heard about your locomotive purchase, and I wanted to talk with you about it. Luis braced himself for another lecture about financial responsibility. But Tommy's eyes held curiosity rather than judgment. I've been researching the railroad history of this area for a book project, and Desert Rose has an interesting past. She didn't run typical passenger or freight routes. During World War II, she was part of a classified mail system, carrying government correspondence and documents along routes that weren't listed on public timetables. Clara appeared at Luis's side, her eyes bright with vindication. I told you she was special, Grandpa. Tommy smiled at her enthusiasm. Mind if I take a look at her sometime? I'd love to see what kind of modifications they made for those classified runs. Sometimes trains like that had hidden compartments, special communication equipment, things that made them unique. For the first time since signing the papers, Luis felt a spark of hope that their decision might not have been complete madness. You're welcome to examine her any time. Tommy, we'd appreciate the expert opinion. Over the following days, word spread about Tommy's research, and the community's attitude began to shift slightly. Not everyone was convinced, but the mockery started giving way to cautious curiosity. Desert Rose wasn't just a rust bucket. She was a piece of local history that nobody had bothered to investigate. Clara spent every afternoon after school at the rail yard, armed with a notebook and her grandmother's old tape measure. She approached the locomotive's exploration with scientific method that impressed even the skeptics, documenting measurements, sketching details, and recording observations about Desert Rose's unique features. It was on a Thursday afternoon, while Luis was helping her measure the locomotive's wheelbase, that Clara made her first significant discovery. Crawling beneath the massive engine to examine the undercarriage, she called out excitedly, "Grandpa, there's writing here!" Numbers and letters carved into the metal. Luis squeezed into the narrow space beside her, using his phone's flashlight to illuminate the hidden markings. Sure enough, carved into a support beam where casual observers would never see them was a series of numbers and letters. RR 1943 SM7. What do you think it means? Clara asked, her voice echoing in the confined space. Railroad 1943, Luis said slowly. But I don't know about the rest. When they showed Tommy the markings the next day, his excitement was palpable. This is incredible. SM probably stands for Special Mail. These trains had their own coding system for classified runs. And the number 7, that might indicate this was the 7th locomotive modified for the program. The discovery energized Clara's exploration. She began finding other anomalies, panels that seemed slightly different from standard locomotive construction, small spaces that might have been designed for concealment. Subtle modifications that suggested Desert Rose had indeed been more than an ordinary mail train. But it was Jake Morrison who provided the most intriguing piece of the puzzle. On Saturday morning, he appeared at the locomotive carrying a shoebox filled with old papers. Found these in my office filing cabinet, figured they might interest you. Previous owner left them when he sold the rail yard to my daddy back in '68. Most of it's just maintenance records, but there's some odd stuff in there too. Among the maintenance logs and repair receipts, Clara found a folded document that made her heart race. It was a partial blueprint, dated 1943, showing modifications to a locomotive's engine compartment, including what appeared to be a hidden storage area built into the boiler system. "Grandpa," she whispered, holding the faded paper with trembling hands. "I think Desert Rose has secrets we haven't found yet." As Luis studied the blueprint, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert evening air. The document was official, bearing government stamps and engineering specifications that suggested whatever Desert Rose had carried during the war, it had been important enough to require sophisticated concealment. That night, as Clara fell asleep, clutching the blueprint like a treasure map, Luis sat on their small porch, staring toward the rail yard. Their $300 gamble was beginning to look less like financial suicide and more like the first step of a journey neither of them could have imagined. In the distance, Desert Rose sat silent under the stars, keeping secrets that had waited nearly 80 years for the right people to discover them. Soon, those secrets would transform everything the community thought they knew about the quiet 8-year-old girl and her grieving grandfather who had dared to believe in something bigger than themselves. Clara developed a routine that worried the adults and fascinated the other children. Every day after school, she walked the 8 blocks from Cedar Junction Elementary to the rail yard, her backpack heavy with notebooks, measuring tools, and snacks that would sustain her through hours of methodical exploration. Desert Rose had become her second home, and she treated the locomotive's mysteries with the seriousness of a professional investigator. "She talks to it," whispered Jessica Martinez during recess, watching Clara sketch locomotive diagrams instead of playing hopscotch. "My mom says grief makes kids do weird things sometimes." But Clara's teacher, Miss Rodriguez, noticed something different in her quiet student's behavior. Rather than retreating into fantasy, Clara seemed to be developing remarkable focus and analytical skills. Her writing assignments grew more detailed. Her math improved as she calculated measurements and proportions. And she began asking thoughtful questions about history and engineering that impressed the school's librarian. Meanwhile, Luis threw himself into job hunting with desperate energy. At 72, with a pension that barely covered their basic expenses, finding additional work in Cedar Junction proved challenging. The hardware store needed weekend help, but could only offer minimum wage for a few hours. The diner required someone who could work nights, but Luis worried about leaving Clara alone. Each rejection reminded him how precarious their financial situation had become since spending their emergency fund. It was during one of these job interviews that Luis discovered Maria's recipe box sitting on the kitchen counter, exactly where she'd always kept it, but somehow more prominent than he remembered. Inside, among her handwritten cards for tamales and chocolate cake, he found something that made his hands tremble, a small envelope addressed to Luis and Clara in Maria's careful script. "My dearest hearts," the letter began. "If you're reading this, it means you've found Desert Rose, and the journey I always hoped you'd take together has begun. There are things about my family's history that I never told you, stories that seemed too incredible to share while I was alive. My father, your great-grandfather Clara, worked for the railroad during the war, not as a regular conductor, but as someone who helped transport things that couldn't travel on normal trains." Luis read the letter 3 times before showing it to Clara, each reading deepening his amazement at his late wife's hidden knowledge. Maria had known about Desert Rose all along, had somehow guided them toward this discovery through her bedtime stories and subtle suggestions. "She knew," Clara said simply after reading her grandmother's words. "She knew we'd need something to believe in after she was gone." The letter changed everything for Luis. What had seemed like an impulsive decision, driven by grief, now felt like following a path Maria had carefully prepared for them. His job search took on new urgency, not just to survive financially, but to honor his wife's faith in their journey. Tommy Chen's research provided the next breakthrough. After spending a week in the county archives and making calls to railroad historical societies, he arrived at their door with a folder thick with photocopied documents and a barely contained excitement. "I've been wrong about Desert Rose," he he announced, spreading papers across their kitchen table. She wasn't just carrying mail. Look at this. The documents revealed that Desert Rose had been part of something called the Patriot Line, a classified network of trains that transported sensitive government materials between military installations and strategic locations throughout the Southwest. The routes weren't random. They connected places where vital wartime research was conducted, materials were manufactured, and secrets were stored. Your locomotive carried everything from weapons blueprints to coded communications to, Tommy paused dramatically, financial instruments. War bonds, investment certificates, things that needed to reach their destinations without passing through normal banking channels. Clara absorbed this information with the same seriousness she brought to her daily explorations. So Desert Rose was like a moving safe? More than that, Tommy said. She was part of a system designed to protect America's most valuable resources during our most dangerous time. The revelation attracted attention beyond their small community. Sarah Walsh, a freelance journalist from Phoenix who specialized in historical mysteries, called requesting an interview. Her interest wasn't in mocking their purchase, but in exploring the untold story of wartime Arizona's role in national security. This could be significant, Sarah explained during their phone conversation. There are gaps in the historical record about how the government moved sensitive materials during World War II. If Desert Rose still contains evidence of those operations, it could rewrite some important history, but not everyone welcomed the growing attention. Mrs. Henderson's concern evolved from mockery to genuine worry about Clara's well-being. Louise, that child is spending too much time living in the past, she argued during one of her increasingly frequent visits. She needs to be playing with children her age, not obsessing over a broken-down train and war stories. The criticism stung because Louise shared some of the same concerns. Clara's dedication to exploring Desert Rose was impressive, but it also isolated her from typical childhood activities. When other kids were riding bikes or playing video games, Clara was documenting rivets and measuring boiler dimensions. Maybe Mrs. Henderson's right. Louise confided to Bob during one of the mechanic's volunteer sessions, helping to clean years of debris from the locomotive's cab. I worry that Clara's using this train to avoid dealing with her grief. Bob, who had become unexpectedly invested in the project, paused in his work, scraping rust from a gauge panel. You know what I see when I watch that little girl? I see someone who's found her purpose. My own grandson spends 6 hours a day on video games and couldn't tell you what he wants to be when he grows up. Clara's 8 years old, and she's already conducting scientific research. The validation helped. But Luis's concerns deepened when the school principal, Dr. Martinez, again, no relation, called requesting a meeting. Clara's not in trouble, Dr. Martinez assured him in her office Monday morning. But her teachers are noticing some changes in her social interaction. She's become very focused on her train project, sometimes to the exclusion of classroom activities that don't relate to her research. Luis felt the familiar weight of doubt settling on his shoulders. Had he enabled an obsession that was harming Clara's development? Was Mrs. Henderson right about grief clouding his judgment? But that afternoon, watching Clara show Tommy the detailed journal she'd been keeping about Desert Rose's construction and modifications, Luis saw something that eased his worries. Clara wasn't retreating from reality. She was engaging with it more deeply than most adults. Her exploration of the locomotive had sparked interests in history, engineering, mathematics, and problem-solving that were advancing her education in ways traditional classroom learning never could. "Grandpa," Clara said that evening as they walked home from the rail yard, "I found something today that I want to show you tomorrow. It's hidden really well, but I think it might be important." Luis looked down at his granddaughter's confident, thoughtful face and realized that Maria's final gift to them wasn't just a locomotive full of secrets. It was Clara's transformation from a grieving child into a young person with purpose, curiosity, and unshakable faith in the power of persistence. Whatever Clara had discovered in Desert Rose's depths, Luis knew their journey was far from over. The community's skepticism was gradually giving way to curiosity, and even the critics were beginning to admit that something remarkable might be hidden within that rusted shell. As they reached their front porch, Clara turned back toward the rail yard where Desert Rose sat silhouetted against the sunset sky. "She's telling me we're getting close to something really important, Grandpa. Something that's going to change everything." Clara's discovery waited beneath a loose floorboard in Desert Rose's cab, hidden so cleverly that only someone with her combination of patience and small hands could have found it. The wartime railway schedule she extracted from its waterproof wrapping was unlike anything Tommy had seen in his research, a document that revealed the true scope of the Patriot Line's operations. "Look at these route numbers," Tommy said, studying the faded timetable with a magnifying glass. "They don't match any public schedules from that era. And these destination codes, I've never seen anything like them." The schedule showed Desert Rose making stops at locations that weren't on standard maps, coded destinations with names like Sierra Station and Phoenix Depot 7. But what made Luis's pulse quicken were the cargo notations written in tiny print beside each. "Stop. Secured materials," he read aloud. "Federal transport priority. Special handling required." This wasn't just mail, was it? Clara traced her finger along the schedule's routes, connecting dots that formed a pattern across Arizona and New Mexico. "Grandpa, what if Desert Rose was carrying things that were so important they couldn't trust regular trains or trucks?" The implication hung in the air like desert heat. If Maria's family stories were true, if Desert Rose had indeed transported classified materials during World War II, then somewhere within the Locomotive's steel shell might be remnants of those shipments, documents, containers, or evidence that had been waiting decades for discovery. But Luis's growing excitement was tempered by mounting practical concerns. The electric bill had arrived with a late notice. His job search had yielded only part-time work at the hardware store, and Mrs. Henderson's daily phone calls reminded him that responsible grandfathers didn't gamble their family's security on historical treasure hunts. "Maybe we should contact the government," he suggested during dinner, watching Clara sketch detailed diagrams of the locomotive's internal structure. "If there are federal materials in that train, they might have a legal claim to them." Clara's pencil stopped moving. "But what if they take Desert Rose away? What if they say we can't explore her anymore?" The fear in her voice made Luis realize how much the locomotive had come to mean to his granddaughter. Desert Rose wasn't just a research project. She had become Clara's connection to her grandmother's memory, her pathway to understanding family history, and her source of purpose during the most difficult period of her young life. Sarah Walsh's arrival in Cedar Junction the following week brought both opportunity and complications. The journalists' professional interest in their story attracted attention from sources Luis hadn't expected: historians, government researchers, and collectors who specialized in wartime memorabilia. "I've been contacted by 3 different museums since my preliminary article was published online," Sarah explained during their interview in the small diner on Main Street. "There's genuine academic interest in what you've discovered. But I have to warn you, that kind of attention comes with pressures." She was right. Within days, Luis received calls from universities offering to fund a professional archaeological survey of Desert Rose, collectors inquiring about purchasing any artifacts you might find, and government officials asking polite but persistent questions about the locomotive's current legal status. Clara handled the attention with remarkable composure for an 8-year-old, but Luis noticed subtle changes in her behavior. She became more protective of her research, more secretive about her daily discoveries, more insistent that outsiders shouldn't be allowed to explore Desert Rose without her supervision. "She's becoming possessive," Mrs. Henderson observed during one of her increasingly pointed visits. "That's not healthy for a child her age. She needs to be sharing, playing with friends, not guarding secrets like some kind of little hermit." The criticism stung, because Luis had noticed the same thing. Clara's confidence had grown tremendously, but so had her isolation from peers who couldn't understand her obsession with locomotive history and wartime mysteries. It was Bob who provided perspective during one of his weekend volunteer sessions. "You know what your granddaughter reminds me of? My nephew who became an engineer. When he was Clara's age, he was just as focused on taking apart radios and building model bridges. Everyone thought he was antisocial, but he was actually developing skills that would define his whole career." The conversation gave Luis hope, but his financial worries continued mounting. The part-time work at Miller's hardware store helped, but it wasn't enough to restore their emergency fund or provide security for Clara's future. Each evening, he stared at their meager bank balance and questioned whether honoring Clara's dreams was worth the risk of genuine hardship. Tommy's research provided both answers and new questions. His contacts at the National Archives had confirmed that the Patriot Line was real, that Desert Rose had indeed been modified for classified transport, and that several locomotives from the program had never been fully inventoried after the war ended. "What that means," Tommy explained during one of their regular evening meetings, "is that there's no official record of what your train might still contain. The government basically lost track of some of these locomotives when they were sold as surplus." Clara absorbed this information with the intensity she brought to all aspects of their investigation. "So we're the first people to really look for whatever's still hidden in there?" "As far as I can determine, yes. And based on this schedule you found, Desert Rose was carrying some of the program's most sensitive materials." That night, as Clara fell asleep clutching the railway schedule like a treasure map, Luis sat on their small porch, wondering if they were on the verge of discovery or disaster. The community's attitude had shifted from mockery to curiosity, but he could feel undercurrents of resentment from people who thought an old man and a little girl had no business playing with things beyond their understanding. The anonymous note slipped under their door the next morning confirmed his concerns. "Some secrets should stay buried. Stop digging before you find something you can't handle." Luis crumpled the note without showing it to Clara, but its message lingered in his mind. Were they approaching something genuinely dangerous? Had Desert Rose's original cargo included materials that were still classified, still sensitive enough to attract unwanted attention? As Clara prepared for another afternoon of exploration, Luis made a decision. Tomorrow, he would contact Tommy about arranging for professional equipment to examine the locomotive's interior safely. If Desert Rose truly contained wartime secrets, they needed to approach the discovery with appropriate caution and expertise. But first, they needed to find what Clara's instincts kept telling her was hidden somewhere in the locomotive's steel heart, the final piece of the puzzle that would explain why Maria had guided them toward this incredible journey. The brass compass Clara found wedged behind a loose panel in Desert Rose's cab looked deceptively simple, a circular instrument no larger than her palm, its needle pointing steadily toward magnetic north despite decades of neglect. But when she cleaned away the grime and examined it closely, she discovered engravings around its rim that made her pulse quicken, tiny numbers and letters that matched the coding system from the railway schedule. "Grandpa, look at this," Clara called excitedly from inside the locomotive's cab. "The compass has the same markings as the timetable." Luis climbed carefully into the cab, his joints protesting the awkward movement, and studied the artifact his granddaughter had discovered. Sure enough, etched into the brass were combinations like PD7 and SS12, codes that appeared on the secret railway schedule as destination markers. "It's like a treasure map," Clara whispered, turning the compass slowly and watching how its needle maintained true north regardless of her movements. But instead of pointing to treasure, it points to the places where Desert Rose used to make her secret stops. Tommy's expertise proved invaluable when they showed him the compass the next afternoon. His eyes widened as he examined the engravings through his magnifying glass, cross-referencing them with the growing collection of documents they'd assembled about the Patriot Line. "This is incredible," he said, his voice hushed with academic excitement. "Do you realize what you found? This isn't just any compass. It's a navigation aid specifically created for the classified mail routes. The conductors would have used this to verify they were approaching the correct coded destinations, but Tommy's enthusiasm was tempered by growing concern about the attention their discoveries were attracting. That morning, a black sedan with government plates had been spotted parked near the rail yard, its occupants observing Desert Rose through binoculars before driving away without making contact. "We may need to consider involving federal authorities," Tommy suggested carefully. "If Desert Rose still contains classified materials from World War II, there could be legal implications for continuing our investigation." Clara's reaction was immediate and fierce. "They can't take her away. Desert Rose chose us. Grandma led us to her. We have to finish what we started." Louise felt torn between protecting Clara's emotional investment and acknowledging the practical realities of their situation. Government interest in their locomotive could bring resources and expertise to their investigation, but it might also mean losing control over a discovery that had become central to Clara's healing process. The community's response to their growing fame was equally complicated. Cedar Junction's main street bustled with activity as journalists, historians, and curiosity seekers arrived to learn about the mysterious locomotive and the 8-year-old girl who was uncovering its secrets. Local businesses experienced a boost as visitors needed meals, gas, and places to stay. But long-time residents felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention. "It's getting out of hand," Mrs. Henderson complained during her daily check-in call. "Poor Clara can't walk to school without strangers trying to interview her. This is no environment for a grieving child." The criticism felt increasingly unfair to Louise, who watched Clara handle media attention with poise and intelligence that impressed even skeptical adults. Rather than being overwhelmed by the publicity, his granddaughter seemed to thrive on sharing her discoveries and educating others about Desert Rose's historical significance. Miss Rodriguez provided a different perspective during a parent-teacher conference that week. "Clara's transformation has been remarkable," the teacher explained. "Her research project has improved her skills in mathematics, reading comprehension, public speaking, and critical thinking. She's actually ahead of grade level in several subjects now." The validation helped Louise resist pressure from well-meaning neighbors who insisted Clara needed normal childhood activities instead of historical investigation. But his financial worries continued mounting, despite the part-time work at the hardware store. Their savings remained depleted, winter heating bills were approaching, and Clara would need new clothes soon. Sarah Walsh's feature article in Arizona History magazine brought both opportunity and complications. The detailed story about Desert Rose attracted serious academic attention, including an offer from the Smithsonian Institution to fund a professional archaeological survey of the locomotive. The grant would cover all expenses, Sarah explained during a phone conversation. "Full documentation, professional equipment, expert analysis of whatever you find." But it would also mean temporarily transferring custody of Desert Rose to the museum during the investigation. Clara's response was predictably negative. "They want to take her away and study her like she's just a thing in a lab. But Desert Rose isn't just history, she's family." The depth of Clara's emotional attachment to the locomotive worried Louise. But he also recognized that Desert Rose had given his granddaughter something precious, a sense of purpose, a connection to family history, and the confidence that came from making meaningful discoveries. It was Bob who offered the most practical advice during one of their weekend maintenance sessions. "You know what I think? I think Clara's got better instincts about that train than all these experts combined. She's been patient, methodical, respectful. Maybe instead of handing Desert Rose over to strangers, you should trust the little girl who's been taking care of her all along." That evening, as Clara fell asleep holding the brass compass like a talisman, Louise made a decision. They would continue their investigation independently for now, using Tommy's expertise and Sarah's documentation, but maintaining control over their discoveries. If Desert Rose held secrets worth finding, Clara deserved to be the one who found them. But Luis couldn't shake the feeling that they were approaching something significant, something that would test not just their determination to uncover the truth, but their ability to handle whatever that truth might reveal. The anonymous warning note had been joined by others, each more urgent in its insistence that they stop digging into matters beyond their understanding. As he checked the locks on their doors that night, Luis wondered if their quest for Desert Rose's secrets was leading them toward discovery or danger, and whether he would recognize the difference in time to protect the granddaughter who had already sacrificed so much. The brass compass sat on Clara's nightstand, its needle pointing steadily north, seemingly ordinary except for the coded engravings that promised answers to questions they were only beginning to understand. The sealed letter Clara discovered tucked behind the brass compass changed everything they thought they knew about Desert Rose's wartime service. Written on official U.S. Army letterhead and dated September 15, 1943. The personal message from Sergeant Michael Torres to his wife Elena revealed the human cost of the classified operations their locomotive had supported. "My dearest Elena," Clara read aloud in the locomotive's cab, her young voice giving weight to words written 80 years earlier. "If you're reading this, it means something has happened to me during our mission. I can't tell you much about what we're transporting, but I need you to know that every man on this train believes we're carrying something that could help end this war sooner." Luis listened intently as Clara continued, reading the soldier's final message to his family, describing Desert Rose as more than just a locomotive. "She's our guardian angel, protecting cargo that could save thousands of lives." The letter contained specific references to secured materials in Compartment 7 and emergency protocols for hostile contact, confirming that Desert Rose had indeed carried far more than routine military mail. But it was the letter's closing paragraph that made Luis's hands tremble. "Tell our daughter that her papa loved her more than all the stars in the desert sky. And if anything happens to this train or its cargo, make sure someone who can be trusted continues the mission. Some secrets are too important to die with the men who carry them." Clara folded the letter carefully, her expression thoughtful beyond her years. "Grandpa, what if we're not just finding history? What if we're supposed to finish something that Sergeant Torres and his men started?" The question haunted Luis as media attention intensified around their discoveries. Sarah Walsh's follow-up articles had attracted national interest, bringing reporters from major newspapers and television stations to Cedar Junction. The small town struggled to accommodate the sudden influx of visitors, but local businesses thrived on the unexpected tourism boom. "Never seen anything like it," Bob commented during their weekend maintenance session, gesturing toward the crowd of spectators gathered at the rail yard's fence. Folks driving here from 3 states away just to get a look at Clara's train. But the attention brought complications neither Luis nor Clara had anticipated. Government officials became more persistent in their inquiries about Desert Rose's contents, citing national security concerns that dated back to the original Patriot Line operations. A formal letter from the Department of Defense requested voluntary cooperation with a routine historical inventory. That sounded anything but routine, Tommy's. Research had attracted academic colleagues who questioned his decision to work independently rather than through established institutions. "You're dealing with potentially significant historical artifacts," Dr. Patricia Williams from Arizona State University argued during a tense phone conversation. "Amateur investigation could damage or destroy evidence that belongs in professional archives." Clara's response to the mounting pressure revealed the strength she'd developed. Through months of patient investigation, when a reporter asked if she felt overwhelmed by adult experts questioning her methods, she answered with quiet confidence. Desert Rose waited 80 years for someone who would listen to her stories. "I don't think she was waiting for experts. I think she was waiting for someone who cared about the people who served on her, the community rally that began forming around Clara's. Cause surprised even Luis. Miss Rodriguez organized a petition supporting the Martinez family's right to continue their investigation. Bob recruited other mechanics and craftsmen to volunteer their expertise for Desert Rose's restoration. Even Mrs. Henderson, despite her continued concerns about Clara's social development, began defending their project against critics who suggested an 8-year-old had no business handling historical artifacts. That little girl has shown more respect and careful attention to that locomotive than most adults would, Mrs. Henderson declared during a heated town council meeting. If the government wants Desert Rose, they should have taken better care of their records 80 years ago. The town council meeting itself became a turning point in public opinion. Mayor Patricia Santos, elected on a platform of economic development, recognized that Desert Rose had brought more visitors and revenue to Cedar Junction than any tourism initiative in the town's recent history. We're talking about preserving local history while supporting a family that's brought positive attention to our community, Mayor Santos argued. I don't see why we should rush to hand over something that's become a source of pride and economic benefit for our residents. But Luis's worries extended beyond public relations and tourism revenue. The anonymous threats had escalated from vague warnings to specific intimidation. Phone calls with no voice on the other end, strangers photographing their house, and a mysterious break-in at the rail yard that resulted in nothing being stolen, but left clear evidence that someone had examined Desert Rose thoroughly. Maybe we should accept the Smithsonian's offer, Luis suggested during dinner, watching Clara sort through photographs of locomotive components she'd been cataloging. Professional security, expert analysis, full documentation of whatever we find. Clara's reaction was immediate and passionate. Grandpa, you taught me that some things are more important than being safe. You said that's what Grandma meant when she told stories about brave people doing difficult things. The truth of his own lessons, reflected back by his granddaughter, left Luis both proud and terrified. Clara had internalized the values he and Maria had tried to teach her, but applying those values to their current situation meant accepting risks that kept him awake at night. Tommy provided support for continuing their independent investigation, but his own concerns were growing. I've been contacted by colleagues who think we're in over our heads, he admitted. There are protocols for handling classified historical materials, legal procedures we're supposed to follow. Are we breaking any laws? Clara asked with the direct honesty that continued to impress adults. Not exactly, Tommy replied, but we're operating in a gray area that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. It was Sarah Walsh who offered the most balanced perspective during her latest visit to document their progress. You've made discoveries that professional archaeologists might have missed because you approached Desert Rose with patience and personal investment rather than academic detachment. But you're also dealing with materials that have genuine national security implications. As Clara fell asleep that night, still holding Sergeant Torres's letter, Luis sat on their porch staring toward the rail yard where Desert Rose waited under security lights that the town had recently installed. Their locomotive had become the center of a complex web of historical significance, legal questions, community pride, and personal meaning that seemed to grow more complicated each day. Tomorrow, Clara planned to use the brass compass and Sergeant Torres's letter to locate Compartment 7, the hiding place where Desert Rose's most important secrets might still be waiting for discovery. Luis knew that whatever they found would change their lives forever, but he was no longer certain whether that change would bring triumph or disaster. The professional safecracker arrived on a Tuesday morning that would forever divide Clara's life into before and after. Marcus Webb had driven down from Phoenix at Tommy's request, bringing specialized equipment designed to open vintage security containers without damaging their contents. As a retired military explosive ordnance disposal expert, he understood both the historical significance and potential dangers of wartime storage systems. Found Compartment 7 exactly where the letter indicated? Clara reported excitedly, leading the adults to the precise location in Desert Rose's boiler housing where Sergeant Torres's clues had guided her. It's sealed with some kind of mechanism I can't figure out, but I can tell there's definitely something inside. The compartment itself was a marvel of 1940s. Engineering, a waterproof steel container built into the locomotive structure so seamlessly that only someone with detailed knowledge of its location could have found it. Webb examined the locking mechanism with professional appreciation, noting the quality of craftsmanship that had protected its contents for 8 decades. Military-grade security, he observed, setting up his equipment while Clara, Luis, Tommy, and Sarah watched with barely contained anticipation. Whatever they put in here, they wanted it to stay hidden until someone with proper authorization came looking for it. The opening process took nearly 3 hours of careful work, with Webb explaining each step to ensure nothing inside would be damaged by sudden exposure to air and light. Clara documented everything with her notebook and digital camera, maintaining the methodical approach that had guided her investigation from the beginning. "Here we go," Webb announced finally, as the ancient mechanism yielded to his expertise. "Let's see what Sergeant Torres and his crew thought was worth hiding for 80 years. The brass box inside was smaller than Clara had imagined, roughly the size of a large jewelry case, but its weight suggested substantial contents. Webb lifted it carefully from its housing, noting the official seals and warning labels that covered its surface in multiple languages. U.S. Treasury Department, he read aloud. Federal Reserve Authorization. Emergency War Powers Act. He looked up at the assembled group with growing excitement. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we're looking at something that was considered extremely valuable during World War II. Clara's hands trembled as she helped Webb document the box's exterior markings before attempting to open it. Inside, wrapped in oiled silk that had preserved them perfectly, were documents that made everyone present catch their breath simultaneously. War bonds. Not just a few ceremonial certificates, but a carefully organized collection of U.S. Treasury bonds issued during 1943 and 1944, each bearing official seals and signatures that authenticated their legitimacy. Tommy counted them twice before announcing the total, 47 individual bonds, with denominations ranging from $1,000 to $50,000. But it was Sarah Walsh, with her journalist's attention to financial details, who calculated the figure that changed everything. "Do you realize what these are worth today?" she asked, her voice hushed with amazement. "With 80 years of compound interest, conservative calculation puts the current value at..." She paused, double-checking her math on her phone's calculator. "Approximately $18 million. The silence that followed was broken only by the desert wind, whistling through Desert Rose's broken windows. Clara stared at the bonds spread across the makeshift table Webb had set up, her 8-year-old mind struggling to process numbers that large. 18 million? Luis repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you certain?" Sarah nodded grimly. "These bonds were designed to fund the war effort with the promise that they'd continue earning interest until redeemed. The government assumed they'd be claimed within a few years, but these were never turned in." Clara's reaction surprised everyone present. Instead of excitement about the enormous sum, she carefully examined one of the bonds, reading the patriotic language about supporting American soldiers and defeating tyranny. "These belong to people who were trying to help win the war," she said quietly. Sergeant Torres and his crew were protecting something that was supposed to help other families, not make us rich. Her mature perspective on the discovery impressed even Webb, who had handled numerous valuable historical finds during his career. "That's exactly the right attitude, young lady. These bonds represent sacrifice and service, not just money." But the implications of their discovery extended far beyond Clara's thoughtful response. Within hours of Sarah's preliminary phone calls to verify the bond's authenticity, government officials arrived in Cedar Junction with an urgency that hadn't been present during their previous inquiries. Federal agents from the Treasury Department accompanied by representatives from the Department of Defense and the National Archives, set up a command post at Cedar Junction's small city hall. Their message was clear. The war bonds represented federal property that had been missing for 8 decades, and their recovery triggered protocols designed to ensure proper custody and evaluation. We appreciate the Martinez family's care in preserving these historical artifacts, Agent Patricia Morrison explained during an emergency meeting with local officials. But materials of this value and historical significance require federal oversight to ensure they're handled appropriately. Clara's response revealed the strength she'd developed. Through months of patient investigation and growing pressure, when Agent Morrison suggested that professional custody would ensure the bond's safety, Clara replied with quiet confidence. Desert Rose kept them safe for 80 years before anyone else even knew they existed. I think she's done pretty well so far. The media response was immediate and overwhelming. News crews from national networks descended on Cedar Junction, transforming the small desert town into the center of a story that captured public imagination. The narrative of an 8-year-old girl and her grandfather discovering an $18 million treasure in a rusted locomotive appealed to people's sense of wonder and justice. But Luis found himself caught between pride in Clara's achievement and terror at the forces their discovery had unleashed. Government lawyers questioned their legal right to the bonds. Treasure hunters and con artists appeared overnight, offering deals and partnerships that sounded too good to be true. Security concerns required police presence around their house and the rail yard. Maybe this is too big for us to handle, Luis confided to Tommy during a rare moment of privacy. Clara's just a child. She shouldn't have to deal with lawyers and federal agents and people trying to take advantage of her discovery. Tommy's response reflected his own growing concerns about their situation. But look at how she's handled everything so far. Clara hasn't just found those bonds. She's become their guardian. Maybe that's exactly what Sergeant Torres and his crew intended when they hid them in Desert Rose. The plot twist that had seemed like a fairy tale ending was revealing itself as the beginning of an even more complex challenge. The $18 million represented opportunity and security beyond anything Clara or Luis had imagined. But it also brought responsibilities and dangers they were only beginning to understand. As Clara fell asleep that night, still clutching one of the war bond certificates she'd been allowed to keep for documentation purposes, Luis realized their journey with Desert Rose had reached a turning point. The Locomotive's secrets were no longer safely hidden. They were exposed to a world full of people who saw $18 million rather than the sacrifice. And service Clara recognized in those yellowed papers tomorrow would bring legal battles, media scrutiny, and difficult decisions about what to do with a treasure that belonged to the past but could transform their future. The quiet 8-year-old girl who had followed her grandmother's stories and her own instincts to uncover Desert Rose's secrets would now have to decide what those secrets were really worth. The original blueprints that Tommy discovered in a forgotten archive at the Arizona Historical Society provided the evidence that would determine Desert Rose's fate and Clara's future. The detailed 1940s engineering plans showed not just the locomotive's secret compartments, but more importantly, they revealed the name of the project's chief engineer, Eduardo Martinez, Clara's great-great-grandfather. This changes everything, Tommy explained excitedly, spreading the blueprints across the Martinez family's kitchen table. These documents prove your family's direct involvement in Desert Rose's wartime modifications. Eduardo wasn't just a railroad worker. He was the chief engineer who designed the hidden compartment system. Clara studied the faded blueprints with the same methodical attention she'd brought to every aspect of their investigation. Her great-great-grandfather's handwriting filled the margins with technical notes and calculations, but it was his personal signature in the corner that made her heart race. E. Martinez, Chief Engineer, Patriot Line Project, October 1943. Luis stared at the signature, seeing his own family name written by a man whose story had been lost to time until this moment. Maria never told me her grandfather was involved in the war effort. She only said he worked for the railroad. Maybe she didn't know the full story herself, Tommy suggested. These operations were classified for decades. Families of people involved in the Patriot Line might not have learned the truth about their relatives' service until years later. The blueprints provided the legal foundation Clara and Luis needed to challenge the federal government's claim on the war bonds. Sarah Walsh immediately contacted civil rights lawyers who specialized in historical property disputes, building a case based on family connection and rightful inheritance. But the legal battle would be complex and expensive, fought against government attorneys with unlimited resources and decades of experience in federal property claims. The Martinez family needed more than just blueprints and family stories. They needed a strategy that could convince a federal judge that an 8-year-old girl and her grandfather deserved to keep an $18 million treasure. The government's argument is straightforward, explained Jennifer Chen, the civil rights attorney who agreed to represent them pro bono after reading Sarah's articles. They claim the bonds were federal property that was never properly transferred to private hands, making their recovery a matter of reclaiming stolen government assets. Clara listened intently as the lawyers discussed complex legal concepts she was only beginning to understand. But the bonds weren't stolen, she interrupted with her characteristic directness. Sergeant Torres and my great-great-grandfather hid them to keep them safe during the war. They were protecting government property, not stealing it. Jennifer Chen smiled at Clara's logical reasoning. That's exactly the argument we need to make. But we'll have to prove that Eduardo Martinez was acting under official authority when he helped hide those bonds, and that his family has legitimate claim to them as compensation for services rendered. The town of Cedar Junction rallied behind the Martinez family with an intensity that surprised longtime residents. Mayor Patricia Santos organized a legal defense fund that raised over $50,000 in its first week. Local businesses displayed signs supporting Clara's cause, and the story attracted nationwide attention from people who saw the case as David versus Goliath. Mrs. Henderson, who had evolved from skeptic to fierce defender, organized letter-writing campaigns and petition drives that brought support from veterans organizations across the Southwest. If this little girl can't keep what she found through honest hard work and family heritage, she declared during a packed town hall meeting, then what's the point of the American dream? Bob Martinez, still no relation, coordinated volunteer efforts to restore Desert Rose while the legal battle proceeded. Professional mechanics and railroad enthusiasts donated time and materials, transforming the locomotive from a rusted hulk into something approaching her wartime glory. The restoration work provided positive media coverage that helped counter government arguments that the Martinez family lacked proper appreciation for historical preservation, but the pressure was taking its toll on Clara's emotional well-being. Despite her public confidence and mature handling of media attention, Luis noticed signs of stress that worried him deeply. Clara's sleep was interrupted by dreams about losing Desert Rose. Her appetite decreased, and she became increasingly protective of the time she spent with the locomotive. Sometimes I wish we'd never found the bonds, Clara confided to her grandfather during one of their evening walks. Everything was simpler when it was just me and Desert Rose trying to understand her stories. Luis felt the weight of responsibility that came with protecting Clara's childhood while supporting her remarkable journey. The lawyers assured him that Clara's legal rights were strong, but federal judges were unpredictable when dealing with cases involving both children and large sums of money. Tommy's research revealed additional complications that strengthened their case but added to the complexity of their situation. Records from the National Archives showed that several other Patriot Line locomotives had carried similar hidden cargoes that were never recovered after the war ended. Desert Rose wasn't unique. She was part of a systematic effort to protect valuable government assets that had been largely forgotten until Clara's discovery brought attention to the entire program. What this means Tommy explained during one of their strategy sessions, is that the government has been inconsistent in claiming ownership of materials from the Patriot Line. They've allowed other discoveries to remain in private hands when families could prove historical connections. Jennifer Chen seized on this precedent to argue that the Martinez family deserved the same consideration given to other families who had discovered wartime materials. But government attorneys countered that the enormous value of Clara's find made it different from previous cases involving smaller caches of documents or personal items. The hearing date was set for 6 weeks away, giving both sides time to prepare arguments that would determine whether Clara kept her $18 million discovery or watched it disappear into federal custody. The intervening time passed in a blur of legal preparations, media interviews, and community support. Activities that transformed Clara from a quiet 8-year-old into a reluctant public figure. Sarah Walsh's book contract provided another source of support for their legal defense while documenting the entire story for historical preservation. Publishers recognized the universal appeal of Clara's journey, and advance sales provided funding for expert witnesses who could testify about the Martinez family's historical connection to Desert Rose. But Luis's concerns extended beyond legal strategies and public relations campaigns. The anonymous threats had escalated again, this time including specific warnings about accidents that could befall people who insisted on keeping things that didn't belong to them. Security cameras were installed around their house and the rail yard, but the sense of being watched persisted. Maybe we should consider a compromise, Luis suggested during dinner. Watching Clara push food around her plate without eating. The government might accept partial ownership, or we could donate the bonds to a museum and take a finder's fee. Clara's response revealed the depth of her commitment to principles that had guided her investigation from the beginning. Grandpa, you taught me that doing the right thing isn't always the easy thing. Sergeant Torres and great-great-grandfather Eduardo trusted their families to continue their mission. We can't quit just because it's getting difficult. The final week before the hearing brought a media circus that overwhelmed Cedar Junction's infrastructure. National news crews, documentary filmmakers, and journalists from around the world descended on the small desert town to cover what had become known as the little girl versus the government case. Clara handled the attention with remarkable composure, but Luis could see the strain in her young face. His granddaughter had found an incredible treasure and sparked a legal battle that would determine not just their financial future, but the precedent for how America treated families who uncovered forgotten pieces of national history. As they prepared for the most important day of their lives, Luis realized that Clara had already won something more valuable than $18 million. She had proven that determination, respect for history, and faith in family stories could lead to discoveries that changed everything, regardless of what any judge might decide about money and government. Property. Tomorrow would bring the climax of their incredible journey, but tonight, Clara fell asleep holding the original blueprints signed by her great-great-grandfather, secure in the knowledge that some victories couldn't be taken away by courts or governments or anyone else who tried to minimize the power of believing in something bigger than yourself. Maria's final testament emerged from the most unexpected place, a safety deposit box at the First National Bank of Cedar Junction that had remained untouched since her death. The discovery happened by accident, when Luis was settling the last of her financial affairs and found a key he didn't recognize among her personal effects. Mrs. Martinez opened this box in 1987 and visited it regularly until about 6 months before her passing, the bank manager explained as he led Luis and Clara through the security procedures. She left specific instructions that it should only be opened if someone came looking for information about Desert Rose and the family's wartime service. Clara's hands trembled as she lifted the handwritten document from the safety deposit box, recognizing her grandmother's careful script, even as she struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what Maria had known all along. The testament was detailed, formal, and addressed specifically to Clara Mercedes Martinez, my beloved granddaughter, when she is old enough to understand the truth. My dearest Clara, the document began, if you are reading this, it means you have found Desert Rose and discovered the secrets she was built to protect. What you may not know is that our family's connection to that locomotive runs deeper than anyone outside our bloodline has ever understood. Luis read over Clara's shoulder, his amazement growing with each paragraph as Maria revealed knowledge she had kept hidden throughout their marriage. She had known about Eduardo Martinez's role as chief engineer of the Patriot Line. She had known about the hidden compartments, the classified cargo, and the war bonds that Desert Rose carried during her final mission in 1944. Your great-great-grandfather Eduardo didn't just design Desert Rose's modifications. Maria's testament continued. He was also responsible for ensuring that certain valuable materials would remain safe if the war took a turn for the worse. The bonds you have found were never intended to return to the federal government. Immediately, they were insurance for the families who risked everything to protect America's secrets. This testament included photocopies of official documents that Maria had somehow obtained decades earlier. Military orders authorizing Eduardo Martinez to implement emergency protocols for valuable asset preservation, Treasury Department correspondence about family compensation for extraordinary service, and a letter from a War Department official acknowledging that certain Patriot Line families were entitled to appropriate consideration for materials preserved through personal sacrifice. But it was Maria's personal explanation that provided the emotional context Clara needed to understand her family's role in history. Eduardo's orders were clear. If the war bonds could not be safely delivered to their original destination, they should be preserved for the families who had sacrificed to protect them. Our family earned those bonds through 3 years of dangerous service, and Eduardo died protecting the secret of their location. Clara absorbed this information with the same thoughtful intensity she had brought to every aspect of their investigation. Her grandmother had known about Desert Rose's treasure all along, had guided them toward its discovery through bedtime stories and gentle suggestions, and had prepared legal documentation to support their claim when the time came. Why didn't she tell us before? Luis asked, his voice thick with emotion at discovering how much his late wife had kept hidden to protect them. Clara found the answer in the testament's final paragraphs. I could never tell you directly, because the knowledge would have burdened you with secrets too dangerous to carry. But I knew that when the right time came, when you were ready to handle the responsibility and the risks, Desert Rose would call to you just as she called to Eduardo all those years ago. The federal courthouse in Phoenix buzzed with media attention as Clara, Luis, and their legal team arrived for the hearing that would determine ownership of the $18 million discovery. Clara wore her best dress and carried a small bag containing the original blueprints, Sergeant Torres's letter, and Maria's testament, documents that told the complete story of her family's connection to Desert Rose. Judge Rebecca Martinez, coincidentally sharing the family name, though no relation, presided over proceedings that attracted national attention. The courtroom was packed with reporters, community supporters from Cedar Junction, and curious spectators drawn by the unusual case of a child challenging the federal government's claim to a wartime treasure. Government attorneys presented their case with professional efficiency, arguing that the war bonds represented federal property that had never been properly transferred to private ownership. They acknowledged the Martinez family's historical connection to Desert Rose, but maintained that personal service, no matter how valuable, didn't constitute legal ownership of classified government assets. The bonds in question were issued by the U.S. Treasury and remain the property of the American people, argued Assistant U.S. Attorney David Richardson. While we recognize the family's dedication to preserving these historical artifacts, federal law is clear about the ownership of unredeemed government securities. Clara listened intently to the government's arguments, taking careful notes in the same notebook she had used to document Desert Rose's secrets. When Jennifer Chen began presenting their defense, Clara felt the weight of months of preparation and discovery focusing into this single moment that would determine their future. "Your Honor," Jennifer Chen began, "this case is about more than legal technicalities regarding government property. It's about recognizing the service and sacrifice of American families who risked everything to protect our nation's most valuable assets during our darkest hour." The defense presented Eduardo Martinez's official military orders, proving that he had acted under federal authority when he designed Desert Rose's hidden compartments. They showed Treasury Department correspondence acknowledging that Patriot Line families deserved appropriate compensation for their extraordinary service. Most importantly, they presented Maria's testament, which provided evidence that the government had specifically intended for certain war bonds to remain with the families who preserved them. Tommy Chen took the witness stand to testify about the historical significance of the Patriot Line and the unique role Desert Rose had played in protecting classified materials. His academic credentials and thorough research provided credible context for the family's claims, explaining how the secret rail network had operated and why families like the Martinez had been entrusted with such sensitive responsibilities. The Patriot Line wasn't just a transportation system, Tommy explained to the court. It was a network of trusted families who understood that America's survival might depend on their willingness to risk everything to protect vital resources. Eduardo Martinez didn't just work for the railroad. He was a guardian of national security. Sarah Walsh testified about her investigation into the historical record, describing how government archives contained gaps that suggested official recognition of family ownership rights for certain Patriot Line materials. Her journalist's attention to detail helped establish that the Martinez family's situation wasn't unprecedented. Other families had been allowed to keep materials they discovered from wartime operations, but it was Clara's testimony that provided the emotional heart of their case. Judge Martinez had initially questioned whether an 8-year-old should testify in federal court, but Clara's maturity and direct knowledge of the evidence made her an essential witness. "Your Honor," Clara said clearly, standing at the witness podium with the dignity of someone twice her age, "I didn't find these bonds because I was looking for money. I found them because I was listening to Desert Rose's stories, just like my grandmother taught me to do." She explained her methodical investigation, her respect for historical preservation, and her understanding of the bonds' significance as symbols of wartime sacrifice rather than mere financial instruments. When the government attorney asked if she understood the enormous value of what she had discovered, Clara's response resonated throughout the courtroom. "I understand that $18 million is more money than most people will ever see," she said quietly. "But I also understand that Sergeant Torres and my great-great-grandfather Eduardo died protecting those bonds, because they represented something more important than money. They represented hope that America would survive, and that the families who sacrificed for freedom would be taken care of." The court recessed for lunch, with both sides having presented compelling arguments. Clara spent the break in a small conference room with Luis and their legal team, trying to process the morning's testimony while preparing emotionally for the judge's decision that would determine whether their incredible journey ended in victory or heartbreak. The restored bell from Desert Rose rang clearly across Cedar Junction for the first time in 40 years. Its brass surface gleaming in the afternoon sun as Judge Martinez delivered her ruling that would transform Clara's life forever. Luis had insisted on having the Locomotive's original bell professionally restored and reinstalled as a symbol of their commitment to honoring Desert Rose's history, regardless of the court's decision about the war bonds. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, Judge Martinez began, her voice carrying the weight of a decision that had attracted national attention. This court finds that the Martinez family has demonstrated legitimate historical connection to the materials in question and has acted with appropriate respect for their historical significance. Clara gripped Luis's hand tightly as the judge continued, her 8-year-old heart pounding with anticipation of words that would determine whether months of patient investigation and legal battle had been worth the struggle. The documentation provided by the defense clearly establishes that Eduardo Martinez was acting under federal authority when he designed the concealment systems aboard Desert Rose. Maria Martinez's testament provides credible evidence that the family was specifically intended to retain custody of materials they preserved through extraordinary personal risk. The courtroom remained silent as Judge Martinez addressed the government's arguments about federal property, rights, and legal precedents. Clara noticed that even the reporters had stopped taking notes, absorbed in the dramatic moment of a federal judge weighing the rights of a small desert family against the claims of the United States government. However, the judge continued, and Clara's heart skipped as she heard the word that might negate everything they had fought for. The court recognizes the government's legitimate interest in ensuring that materials of such historical significance receive appropriate preservation and study. Luis felt his hopes crashing as the judge seemed to lean toward a compromise that would take the bonds away from Clara while acknowledging their family's historical connection. But Judge Martinez's next words proved that Clara's faith in doing the right thing had been justified. Therefore, this court rules that the Martinez family shall retain ownership of the war bonds discovered aboard Desert Rose, with the stipulation that they cooperate with federal historians to ensure proper documentation of their historical significance and that a portion of the bond's value be dedicated to preserving the complete story of the Patriot Line for future generations. The explosion of applause from Cedar Junction supporters filled the courtroom as Clara and Luis realized they had won more than just a legal victory. They had established a precedent that honored both family, heritage, and historical responsibility. Clara's reaction was characteristically thoughtful rather than celebratory, immediately asking about the requirements for historical documentation and preservation. "Your Honor," Clara said, rising from her seat with the formal politeness that had impressed adults throughout their journey. "My family would like to donate half of the bond's value to creating a memorial for all the Patriot Line families, not just our own." Judge Martinez smiled at the 8-year-old's mature response to suddenly becoming a millionaire. "That's a generous gesture, Miss Martinez, and exactly the kind of historical stewardship this court hoped to see from the rightful owners of these materials." The celebration that erupted in Cedar Junction that evening transformed the small desert town into a festival of vindication and community pride. Desert Rose's restored bell rang throughout the night as residents gathered at the rail yard to congratulate Clara and Luis while marveling at the locomotive that had changed all their lives. Mayor Patricia Santos announced that the town would establish a permanent historical museum around Desert Rose, using Clara's donation to create exhibits about the Patriot Line and the families who served America's cause during World War II. The museum would ensure that Sergeant Torres, Eduardo Martinez, and dozens of other forgotten heroes would be remembered for their sacrifice and service. Bob Martinez, still no relation, had completed Desert Rose's restoration just in time for the celebration, and the locomotive's first test run in 4 decades provided a fitting climax to their incredible journey. Clara rode in the cab alongside Luis and Tommy, watching the desert landscape scroll past as Desert Rose's whistle echoed across the mountains where her great-great-grandfather had once carried America's most precious secrets. Mrs. Henderson, whose evolution from skeptic to fierce defender had been one of the story's most remarkable transformations, organized a community dinner that brought together everyone who had supported Clara's cause. Her speech, thanking the Martinez family for bringing Cedar Junction together around something bigger than their Individual problems moved even the most cynical residents to tears. This little girl taught us that believing in something, even when everyone thinks you're foolish, can change not just your own life, but your entire community, Mrs. Henderson declared. Clara didn't just find treasure in that old train, she found the best parts of all of us. Tommy's book about the Patriot Line, co-authored with Clara and illustrated with her detailed sketches of Desert Rose, became a bestseller that introduced millions of readers to the untold story of America's secret wartime railroad network. Sarah Walsh's documentary about their discovery won awards and brought continued positive attention to Cedar Junction's transformation into a destination for history enthusiasts. But for Clara, the greatest victory wasn't the money or the fame or the historical recognition. It was the knowledge that she had honored her grandmother's memory, completed the mission that Sergeant Torres and Eduardo Martinez had started, and proven that even the quietest 8-year-old could change the world by listening carefully to the stories that others couldn't hear. 6 months after the federal court ruling that changed their lives forever, Clara Martinez stood beside the bronze memorial plaque she had designed to honor the brave individuals who operated the secret mail route during America's darkest hour. The memorial garden surrounding Desert Rose bloomed with native desert flowers that Maria would have loved, creating a peaceful space where visitors could contemplate the sacrifice and courage that had preserved democracy through its most challenging test, in memory of all Patriot Line families who risked everything to protect America's tomorrow. Clara read aloud from the plaque's inscription, her voice carrying the confidence of someone whose faith had been rewarded beyond any reasonable expectation. Their courage lives on in the stories we preserve and the freedom we continue to enjoy. Luis watched his granddaughter with pride that still amazed him daily. At 9 years old, Clara had become not just a millionaire, but a guardian of historical memory, using her platform to educate others about the ordinary people who had performed extraordinary service when their country needed them most. The quiet, grieving child who had followed whispers from a rusted locomotive had transformed into a young woman with purpose that extended far beyond her own circumstances. The transformation of Cedar Junction reflected Clara's impact on everyone who had witnessed her journey. What had begun as a struggling desert town, surviving on retiree pensions and stubborn pride, had become a thriving community centered around historical tourism and educational programs. The Desert Rose Heritage Center welcomed thousands of visitors annually, generating jobs and revenue that had revitalized local businesses and provided opportunities for young people who might otherwise have left for larger cities. Mrs. Henderson, whose bed and breakfast now hosted historians and railroad enthusiasts from around the world, had become the unofficial mayor of Cedar Junction's tourism industry. Her fierce defense of Clara's rights during the legal battle had revealed leadership qualities that impressed longtime residents and led to her election to the town council on a platform of historical preservation and economic development. Never thought I'd see the day when our little town would be famous for something good, she reflected during the Memorial Garden's dedication ceremony. Clara didn't just find treasure. She reminded us that our community has always had stories worth telling. Bob Martinez's mechanical expertise had evolved into managing the restoration and maintenance of 3 additional Patriot Line locomotives that had been discovered in rail yards across the Southwest, creating a network of historical sites that told the complete story of America's secret wartime railroad. His volunteer work with Desert Rose had grown into a full-time career that combined his love of machinery with his newfound appreciation for preserving history. Tommy Chen's academic research had expanded into directing the Patriot Line Historical Project, a federally funded initiative that documented the complete scope of the classified rail network and the families who operated it. His collaboration with Clara had produced a comprehensive archive that ensured future historians would have access to stories that had nearly been lost forever. Sarah Walsh's journalism had evolved into writing, historical fiction for young adults, inspired by Clara's example of how children could engage meaningfully with complex historical subjects. Her novels about brave young people discovering family secrets during wartime had won awards and introduced new generations to the importance of preserving historical memory. Desert Rose herself had become more than just a restored locomotive. She was a symbol of the power that came from believing in stories others dismissed as impossible. Her regular runs through the desert carried passengers who came not just to see historical machinery, but to experience the landscape where ordinary people had once performed extraordinary service for their country. Clara's college fund, secured by her careful management of the war bond's value, represented freedom to pursue whatever dreams might emerge as she grew older. But her current interests suggested she might follow in Tommy's footsteps as a historian, or perhaps become a teacher who could share the lessons about courage and persistence that her journey with Desert Rose had taught her. The evening ritual that had sustained Clara and Luis through their most difficult times continued in their restored locomotive. As the sun set behind the mountains, grandfather and granddaughter sat in Desert Rose's cab, Clara sharing the day's discoveries with the train that had become their bridge between past and future, loss and hope, dreams and reality. "Do you think Grandma Maria knew how everything would turn out?" Clara asked during one of these quiet moments, her hand resting on the brass compass that had guided them to their treasure. Luis considered the question while watching the desert transform from gold to purple in the fading light. "I think she knew that if we had faith in each other and in the stories that connect us to something bigger than ourselves, we'd find whatever we needed to find." The 3 generations of family photographs now displayed in Desert Rose's cab told the story of love persisting through loss, courage emerging from grief, and dreams becoming reality through patience and determination. Maria's portrait held a place of honor beside pictures of Clara receiving awards for her historical research, Luis teaching visiting students about locomotive restoration, and Desert Rose herself gleaming with renewed purpose after decades of neglect. Clara's voiceover, recorded for the documentary that would introduce her story to the world, provided the final reflection on their incredible journey. "People always ask me what I learned from finding $18 million in an old train. But the real treasure wasn't money. It was discovering that when you listen carefully to the stories your family tells you, even the ones that sound impossible, you might find that the impossible is just waiting for someone brave enough to believe in it." As Desert Rose's whistle echoed across the desert for the final time that day, it carried forward the legacy of Sergeant Torres, Eduardo Martinez, Maria's bedtime stories, and Clara's unwavering faith that some things are worth believing in, even when everyone else thinks you're foolish. The locomotive's call drifted over the memorial garden where native flowers bloomed, over the restored town where dreams had become reality, and over the desert where the past and future met in the heart of a little girl who had dared to listen when history whispered her name.